Now, to talk more on this latest atrocity by the Zionist regime, we are joined by Mr. Don DeBar, activist and commentator from New York. Mr. Don DeBar, I'm sure you've seen the videos of 15 more people have been killed as they bombed another UN-run school who was sheltering the people, Palestinian, mostly children, women and the elderly, from the Jabalia refugee camp, which they hit earlier on.
That's what impunity looks like. People are seeing it on television across the world now. When you are not answerable to anyone, when you heed no law, rule, regulation, or custom, when your wants become all that matters, including the lives of children, then this is what it looks like. You see it on television.
Mr. Don DeBar, isn't a war supposed to be soldiers against soldiers?
This isn't war, this is genocide. And we've seen it. Some of the grandparents of some of the people that are committing this genocide saw it from the other end in Germany and Poland, 75, 80 years ago. And when faced with it in places like the Warsaw Ghetto and elsewhere, they rose up. They killed the people that were threatening their lives or killing them to try to obtain, some measure of human dignity and freedom and safety for themselves. This is what human beings do when they're confronted with death, oppression, and a future with no hope. And now, what we're seeing is a repressive, the most powerful military force in the history of the world that dumped death and destruction on Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Syria, every place that they could, do this to, they've done it so far.
Mr. Don DeBar, how come people are not waking up? They've seen the atrocities, especially the U.S. has made in Afghanistan, in Iraq, you could say Pakistan, Libya. You have the Ukraine war right now. They're involved in most of the wars, if not all of them.
Well, first of all, even when it's an air force like the Air Force of the State of Israel, as they call it, that's doing the bombing, the United States military has control over the things that are necessary for targeting and also the supply chain. For example, in terms of the supply chain, the U.S. Congress is bandying about another $14.3 billion for Israel in the midst of this battle against the people in Gaza and the West Bank. $14.3 billion given to 10 million people that live in the area they call Israel is $1,400 for every man, woman, and child there. This is coming from the United States, where 70% of the population doesn't have $1,000 for an emergency or to their name in terms of equity. And this is on top of all of the aid and weaponry and everything else, including the actual outright military assistance of the U.S. with 2 carrier groups, ground troops, and people directing the targeting for all of their weapons bought by the taxpayers of the United States. Looking at that $14 billion from the other side, it's the U.S. giving the State of Israel $5,600 for every man, woman, and child in Gaza to murder them. And yet, these numbers it's not heavy mathematics. You don't need Einstein or Newton to calculate this. It's simple arithmetic. The numbers are published here. But for some reason, it doesn't register with the people because no one talks about it as part of the public narrative. What's spoken about here is what happened to the Jews in Germany, and Poland and Ukraine and other places from 1939 or 1933 to 1945. No one mentions, of course, that the United States and the UK did not allow Jews to escape that fate to come here. And they don't mention the fact that major corporations here in the United States, like IBM, GM, and Ford, had a big hand in industrializing Germany, including in the industry of mass execution. What they do instead, somehow, all of the wrongs that were done by European and American governments to the European Jews are laid at the feet of the Palestinians. And in return for that, the reparations are taken from the Palestinians and given to these Europeans. In essence, Israel is a European colonial settler state that's on the land that was occupied by the indigenous Palestinians who've had it since somewhere in the 3rd century AD, and yet they're somehow in the wrong, evil, terrorist maniacs whose children should even be murdered. That's the public narrative here.
Mr. Donderbar, we are seeing massive rallies all around the world. We've seen one today in Washington, D.C. More than 30,000 people attended the pro-Palestine rallies. Now, my question is, they've asked for an immediate ceasefire to the Israeli atrocities. Now, when we're talking about the Western officials, U.S. officials, French officials, UK and also Germany, there's not a single mention of the word ceasefire. They say pause, humanitarian aid, but there's no a single mention about a ceasefire.
Well, there was actually a directive from the head of the State Department, Mr. Anthony Blinken, to his staff, and then also instruction from the office of the White House to the various spokespeople and others in the State Department and the Pentagon and CIA to not mention ceasefire whatsoever, or to counsel publicly or internally anything other than allowing Israel to do what it's doing. There's not to be any restraint put on Israel whatsoever, not even in terms of public relations. And so, you know, what's kind of remarkable is the fact that in Germany today, in Berlin, in London, in Washington, as you mentioned, people are in the street. And also at the United Nations last week, there was a ceasefire resolution in the General Assembly, the only place you could have the discussion, because the United States vetoed, and its puppets vetoed previous versions of such a resolution in the Security Council. But when the pulse of the world was taken on this, out of the 193 nations in the United Nations General Assembly, 120 backed it, and only 14 voted against it, including the United States and Israel. Then out of the other 12, 6 of them are islands that are part of the island chain that the United States hit with nuclear weapons from 1950-something to the early mid-1960s, so they know not to cross the United States or what happens to you. And the other 6 were comprised of the 3 Baltic states, which are the U.S. puppets in NATO, and the Czech Republic, Albania, and I think Moldova, one of the other, puppet states that are former Warsaw Pact countries. The European Union abstained because those governments, if they were to vote against this resolution, the people would be twice, 3 times as many in the streets, maybe some of them tipping over some governments in Europe, because they're that fed up with what's going on. And by the way, so out of all of the good news is on the streets, you're seeing evidence, just like we've seen in a number of other areas, that no matter what the official public narrative is, people find it dissonant with their own experience. When they're told for years the economy is doing well, while almost every person that they know is struggling to get by, when they're told how peaceful their governments are when they're involved in war on a constant basis and taxing the world, taxing their own people, and you see it around the world being taxed for more war, and when you see the specter of World War III hovering over it while they've engaged the Russian Federation with attacks on the Kremlin and on their military bases, these people don't believe the stuff that's on their television anymore, and they're starting to vote with their feet. And this is something that it's a new phenomenon in terms of how broad and deep it is. It's promising, and more importantly, it's not going to be resolved with repression, and it may well end up pushing over a number of governments that could in turn change the foreign policy of a lot of others.
Thank you, Mr. Donderbar. It seems that people are now waking up. Mr. Donderbar, activist and commentator from New York. It's always good to talk to you, sir.